Great Zimbabwe. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and an incredible feat of engineering. But what exactly is it? As you may have gathered, the city of Great Zimbabwe was located in present-day Zimbabwe, just southeast of Masvingo, but the kingdom stretched much further. Looking at the map, we can see the territory covering what is now the whole of Zimbabwe and reaching out to parts of Zambia, Mozambique, Botswana and South Africa. The ruins that we see today are what remains of the capital city, and spanning across 1,800 acres, they're actually the largest ruins in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, the only ruins in Africa which are bigger are the pyramids in Egypt. Interesting fact, if you didn't know already, the name Zimbabwe itself comes from the Shona language. Now the Shona people are the natives and the descendants of Great Zimbabwe. So we've got the word Zimba meaning houses, and Mabwe meaning stones, houses of stones. And looking at the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, it's pretty easy to see how this city got its name. And when the modern day country regained its independence from the British in 1980, it was named Zimbabwe in honour of its amazing history. Now it's thought that construction began on the city around the 9th or 10th century by the settlers of the fallen kingdom of Mapungubwe in South Africa. And at its peak, the city is thought to have been home to anywhere between 25,000 and 40,000 people. From the ruins, we can see three main parts. There's the Great Enclosure, the Hill Complex, and the Valley Ruins. So let's break them down one by one. But before that, I just want to remind you that if you are enjoying the content and you want to support the channel, make sure you like the video and hit that subscribe button. We can build it together. So the Great Enclosure. Now, if you Google Great Zimbabwe, then this is the structure that you'll see. It's perhaps the most well-known part of the ruins, purely for its epic scale and the fact that of all the three surviving structures, it is the most intact. Now, you see just the outer wall of the Great Enclosure is made up of over 1 million individual granite bricks. And just like the rest of the city, it was assembled without the use of any kind of bonding or mortar to help keep it together. It was just sheer precision and balance. With walls that go 11 meters up and more than 250 meters around, the Great Enclosure is also built in such a way that the passage of air through its corridors creates a natural air conditioning system to combat against the intense sun. Now, this is obviously not unique to this kingdom, but this is just another example of how these ancient kingdoms were so much more technologically advanced than they're given credit for. Now, given that the Great Enclosure is probably the grandest structure, potentially in the entire kingdom, you might expect this to be the king's residence. But this palace was actually reserved for his queen, or his chief wife. There were actually many wives, most of whom made endless journeys up and down this hill in order to tend to the king. And that brings us on to the hill complex. The first thing to note about the hill complex is that the hill itself peaks at about 80 meters above ground level, and the king's palace was right at the top, giving him a stunning view of his kingdom and a fair warning of any advancing threat. And speaking of threats, you can see these really narrow pathways and steep steps leading up the hill towards the king's palace. Having such a narrow access route to the king meant that he was very well defended against attack, and there were even checkpoints along the way, posts where the king's guards would be stationed to ambush any oncoming advances. The hill complex is divided into the eastern and western sides. Now, the western side was used as the king's residence, and within it he had a relatively small quarters which was actually made up of wood and was quite rudimentary in its design. This was so that at the end of each king's reign, the quarters could be burned to its foundations and a fresh new wooden quarters could be built on top. Now, the reason they carried out this ritual was because they believed that any negativity or bad spirits which may have been associated with the previous king would hang around in the building and taint the reign of the future king. So to give him a completely fresh start, he'd have a completely fresh home. Now, the eastern side was used for worship and ritual and that kind of thing. And that's where we find Great Zimbabwe's 8 soapstone carved birds. It's been said that maybe these birds represent past kings of the city, but that's unlikely as only 8 birds were discovered and there would have probably been many, many more rulers. So they might have represented royal households or dynasties over time. Or maybe they represented God and were used in acts of worship. Now, this would obviously make sense as they were found in the eastern side of the hill complex where worship would take place. But regardless of their purpose, the significance of the soapstone bird to Great Zimbabwe is in no doubt. Even if we look at the modern flag of Zimbabwe today, what do we see? That very same bird. So now let's move on to the Valley Ruins, and this is the least well preserved of the 3 sites. During the reign of the kingdom, it would have consisted of what are called dagger buildings. These are large buildings made of earth and mud brick, which is maybe the reason why little remains of them. But despite not being made of granite like the king's and queen's palaces, It's thought that these ancient dagger buildings may have been just as grand and wondrous to look at. They were, after all, the housing for other members of the royal family. Now, Great Zimbabwe was a large trader of gold, so when Europeans colonized much later on, their goal was to pillage as much as they possibly could. And although they managed to ransack all parts of the city, the valley being the most low-lying and exposed was probably the easiest target. Now, as I just mentioned, Great Zimbabwe had a booming trade. In fact, the artifacts found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe point to the kingdom being part of a global trade network. These artifacts include pottery from Persia and China's famous Ming dynasty. Now, they had their connections with cities along the East African coast, which made exports and imports fairly simple. And obviously, with so much gold, they were a much sought-after trading partner. So, with trade coming from the Middle East, India, and China, Great Zimbabwe was able to establish itself as one of the wealthiest and grandest kingdoms in Africa at the time. So the decline of the kingdom began around 1450. And by 1700, it's thought that it had all but been abandoned. Perhaps a lack of resources? Well, it seems that the population became so great that the land could no longer support it. Over-farming caused the land to deteriorate and people slowly began to disperse. And although the kingdom was well protected against outside threats, it wasn't immune to its own internal conflicts. When a king would die, there would often be disputes as to who was the rightful successor. And I'm sure you can imagine that this quickly became a weakness for the kingdom. As Great Zimbabwe began to fall, more and more people moved out and formed the nearby Towa dynasty and the Mutapa kingdom. Now, these are both probably videos in their own right, so if you want to see that, let me know in the comments. So just very quickly then, what did the Europeans think of Great Zimbabwe? Well, to be honest, it's the same old story. A black population couldn't have built the city because it was just too intricate and advanced. They theorized that it must have been built by other settlers at some point in history. Maybe the Arabs, the Egyptians, the Greeks, or the Israelites. And even when archaeologists had discovered absolute proof that the city was built by the native Shona people, there was an active suppression of this truth by the then ruling British government. Any reports which supported it were said to undermine their authority and should therefore be discarded. Historians and archaeologists were encouraged to falsify their accounts to support the colonial notion that something like this was beyond the abilities of black people. It kind of just shows the underlying fear that they had, especially when you look at Africa as a whole. From everything that we've discussed on this channel, it's clear that civilizations were much more advanced than the colonizers wanted to believe. The savages could actually work together to build civilized societies, and that was probably a scary thought. And not only was it built by the locals, but it reigned supreme for at least 500 years. If you're enjoying these great stories of ancient African kingdoms, make sure you go and check out this one about ancient Nubia, and I'll see you there.